Hello.
André?
Yeah.
Hi.
Okay. Oh, hi, André. It's Rena Bray calling.
Hi, Rita.
Hi. We're here on stage. We've got your PowerPoint up, and we're ready for you to speak loudly. Speak very loudly.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me?
We can't hear you. You're too soft. So get closer and shout.
I'm really on the phone, so I'll speak like this.
Yes, that's great.
Okay.
Okay.
I may begin?
Yes, you may.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me, Rena. Hello to everyone, and especially to three people I've invited to speak to Montreal, Rena, Dr. Miller, and Magda, whom was in a Generation Zap, the movie. We had a screen it two days ago in Laurentians up here. So I've been writing about healthy housing and sustainable housing for over 30 years, and EMFs since 1992. I'm a political science bachelor and also a journalist. I work at Montreal Gazette. So I'm not a pure scientist, but here is what and I'm also, of course, not a legal expert, but here's what I came up with in the last few weeks working part-time on this. So if you see the first slide showing an image of small cells in front of houses, it's just to tell you why the debate worldwide right now is raging. We had 3 days ago an article in the paper here in Montreal saying that between 40,000 and 60,000 antennas or small cell antennas would be required by 5G only for the island of Montreal. So there's debate on how many, but this is what it may look like. Experts suspect it could be every 2 to 10 houses that these small cells would go up, which has major issues, of course. I'll get back to those later. So my second slide is about the insurance industry. The underwriters, we've seen several articles in the last few years come by, but the original one was from the Observer in 1999, Lloyd's, and also Swiss Re. This is really what it's all about. We know that sooner or later there will be major convictions, and the industry will have to pay, and that's why the insurers and Swiss Re, which insures insurance companies, they refuse to cover these risks, mainly the one linked to mobile phones, of course, and brain tumors. So to me, it's just a matter of time before, how do you say, the piper will be piping, or someone will have to pay. So, but of course, third slide, David versus Goliath. It's not David Fancy necessarily, but to be realistic, we have to understand why the major media is not covering this issue properly. We have a few examples just here in Quebec with Videotron, which has the TVA television network, and also the Journal de Montréal of Quebec, two major dailies. Some of the reporters, of course, the leash isn't that tight. They write about it, but it's very sparse and very superficial, the coverage in the media. And Rogers, coast to coast, of course, has Maclean's and L'Actualité, so they don't cover it as well as we could say as Newsweek has in the U.S. And when Newsweek, I think they had perhaps even a front page story, when Newsweek's a major media like that starts talking about, you can be sure it's a real issue because they're always several years late compared to microwave news, which I've been reading for 30 years. Next slide. Dr. Miller, of course, is among many of the people who have been quoted. This is an article from the CMA Journal, and I'm sure you've covered this today, the outdated Safety Code 6. To me, what's really important is that if you read Cell Phone Task Force, authored by Arthur Furstenberg, Arthur's book, to me, is the best I've read on EMF The Invisible Rainbow. You must read that. It's a history of electricity in life. So what I was saying, I lost my idea here. I'm talking about Arthur. But on his website in 1993, you had the U.S. FDA, the EPA, Environmental Protection, of course, and NIOSH, Occupational Safety. The same year, these three federal bodies in the U.S. said that the FCC standards, which are basically equivalent to Safety Code 6, were outdated because of this thermal effect, which is totally bogus. We know about the non-thermal effects. So the next slide, what to me was very important, is that the CMA Journal quoted Dr. Hardell, who was saying that Safety Code 6 is a disaster to public health. Now, when I met Dr. Hardell in Brussels in 2015, Dr. Belpomme invited me to cover that EMF, the MCS-EHS conference where Magda was, and all the experts. I asked Dr. Hardell what his background was. He's an oncologist and an epidemiologist, and he reminded me that in the late 70s, he was one of the first scientists doing research on dioxin, 2,4-D, later on PCBs, and more lately cell phones, of course, but in between, he did a lot of research on glyphosate, so Roundup. And what's important for everyone to understand is that industry, of course, will always try to attack the credibility of scientists such as Magda. They do that all the time. But she's still standing up, and so is Dr. Hardell. And why? Well, because Hardell was always right. So to me, that's very important. And now I think that the mainstream media should be catching on about this sooner or later. Next slide, number 6, the outdated standards. Now, government and industry always say that their standards, their exposure guidelines, their recommendations, because very often they're not regulations, they're just recommendations, but they always say that they're science-based. Well, this slide shows that it's totally bogus because the standards change from region and government, so it's really based on politics and lobbying, of course. So Canada and the U.S. Are the worst with the European Union, and when you look at the difference, what they're trying to apply in Europe, the 6 volts per meter is we see the mitochondria is damaged and memory loss. We see directly at that level. It should be not a minimum, but a maximum for everyone around the world. So they've lost control, obviously, because what the Bioinitiative report and several studies have shown is that it should be at 0.6, and that's 100 times lower. And I understand that Toronto's trying to apply that. Magda could perhaps comment about if it's being applied. Now, slide 7 is France's Abeille law. Abeille is the name of the politician, a green politician who proposed that law, adopted in 2015, which is probably the best known and most important law in this issue. And they talk about, it's a long title, law relating to sobriety, transparency, information, and consultation. And it starts with that. Just the transparency, the information, the consultation. Things are moving, maybe not quickly, but they're moving because they have to measure the power of the antennas, and they target the ones that are the most, the peak the most. If they're very far from the average of the others, they'll ask the operator to lower the power. But the most important part is that they prohibit Wi-Fi in spaces where you have children under 3 years of age. So that's very important. And they tried to ban Wi-Fi in primary school, elementary school, and they found it too complicated. So what they're doing is they demand that when Wi-Fi is not required for academic purposes, then it must be shut off. question is there someone really following it up? I hope there is, and I have to investigate that. But it's certainly an important point because they have reports to make every year, and they're being watched closely nationally. As you can imagine, the French are very militant, as we've seen in the media recently. Next slide, number 8, is the Dutch government compared international policies on EMFs. It's a recent report from a few years ago. And next slide, we talk about, well, the first group is that the EU recommendation is not legally binding, and different states can adopt regulations, legislation, or not based on that. So the next one, the second group, is mentioning that the states that adopted them, but they're not legally binding. And it's interesting that we see Austria and Sweden in that group because certain cities and regions and groups in those countries, Austria and Sweden, are often quoted as leaders. But if you look nationally what they're doing as well, the Netherlands, it's not very strict. For instance, in the UK, telecoms have just a voluntary code to respect the bogus thermal limits recommended by the EU. However, in other countries, slide number 10, we see China, for instance. They have a national law, an environmental protection law, which sets limits. Interesting that it's for environmental exposure to EMS, but they do not apply to wireless communication terminal equipment. So I guess not what the consumer will buy. So I think globally, perhaps they're just trying to lower or average out what the cell towers are putting out. But it's hard to control what we have in homes and offices, for instance. Still, their limits at 900 megahertz, for instance, are at 9% of the power density of the EU recommendation, so 90% stricter. So they're aware, of course, and well, it's hard. It's not really. We can't talk about transparency if we're talking about countries like Russia and China, but on the surface, they seem to be stricter. India is an interesting country. Excuse me, there's call waiting coming in. I won't take it, of course. They have in India a limit of 33% of the EU reference level for power and 10% for power density. Another example is Switzerland, because things are moving a lot in Switzerland these days against 5G. They're at 10% approximately of the EU recommendation, and that is only, however, for sensitive places of sensitive use. So, for example, apartments, schools, children's playgrounds, near mobile phone antennas and various other antennas. So Switzerland has a history, a good record in that way of trying to apply the precautionary limits. Next slide. Early warnings, we could talk about that forever, but if you go to the Environmental Health Trust website, they're all listed there, who's doing what, with all the details, thanks to Theodora Scataro and Deborah Davis and their team. I've pointed out a few examples. In 2008, Paris removed Wi-Fi from public libraries because of health concerns. Of course, that was employees complaining. What I read, however, afterwards is that they put them back in, and they're just trying to limit, if not shelve the issue, but people are aware. They talk about that all over the media. 2008, the Russian National Committee for Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, they're very, very clear. They're saying that Wi-Fi is really using kids as guinea pigs. So they're saying that children under 16, pregnant women, epileptics, people with memory loss, sleep disorders, and neurological diseases should never, never use cell phones. So that's a strong warning from independent scientists advising the Russian government many years ago, 2008. December 20, the French Parliament passed a law banning advertising towards kids. Other countries have done that as well. And in 2011, the Council of Europe, which is an advisory body, it's not binding, they don't pass regulations. I met in Brussels in 2015 Jean Hus, H-U-S-S, the European Parliament elect, who was behind that resolution, and he explained to me that since it would not become binding, that resolution was adopted unanimously. They really were not influenced by lobbying. It was all science-based, based, of course, on independent scientists. Their work such as Magda's and Dr. Hardell's. So they recommended that to all of the ministers of the different EU countries. So they can't claim that they're not aware. This is 2011, and that resolution, I think it's number 1815, yes, should be read by all politicians, all doctors. All the information is really very well summed up in that paper, which mentions notably protecting the electrical sensitive. There's debate also. Israel is one of the countries that is leading the reduction or prudent avoidance, as we should say, of wireless exposure in schools. The Israeli Ministry of Education is involved in this, but there's debate about how it's being implemented. But they are at least discussing it and taking measures, but parents, teachers, everyone has to put more pressure to make sure that it's being applied. Next slide, number 12.
André, just to cut in very briefly, thank you so much. We have about 5 minutes left for your talk, so that we can have quickly time for questions after. Thank you.
I noticed the time flies, So the New York Supreme Court in 1982 recognized radio wave sickness, and electrosensitivity actually was first diagnosed in 1932. Several tribunals in France have recognized EHS as well since 2013. That was the first case where people are being compensated. The American ADA Act also for access for people with disabilities, that is recognizing also EHS. To me, the one I quote the most is in 2000, the 8 Nordic countries in Europe, including Sweden, recognize MCS and EHS, electromagnetic intolerance, saying that symptoms disappear in non-electrical environments. I mentioned the Toronto prudent avoidance regulation. Mumbai in India, city of 20 million, is also prohibiting towers near schools and colleges and hospitals. Taiwan removed 1,000 cell towers a few years ago, and they have probably the strictest law in the world. Parents can be fined $50,000. That's actually $1,600 if babies are using iPads. That's really incredible. So I won't read all the examples on page 19. That's from the Environmental Health Trust. What I can say is that there's several cantons in Switzerland.
What slide are you on? Sorry.
Number 19, it says Senator Blumenthal, U.S. Senator Blumenthal. So 21 U.S. cities and regions are fighting 5G. Even the Russian Ministry of Defense refuses to transfer frequencies for 5G. And in Switzerland, many cantons, regions, or states there are asking for moratoriums on 5G. They're just delaying it because it seems that the federal government is going to steamroll it. Problem is they can't. They would have to lower or be more tolerant because they can't respect the exposure limits if they roll out 5G. They'll be burning skin pretty soon if they put those small cells in front of houses everywhere. So I'm going to skip the U.S. city ordinances. but several cities are acting to protect location aesthetics and various legal issues. To me, the most important is probably, or one of the most important that will wake people up, is property values. Someone sent me a photo of an apartment in Haight-Ashbury, the upscale San Francisco neighborhood. There was a poll where a small cell is going up soon 7 feet from a window of an apartment, which is worth $1.8 million. So you can bet people are going to be fighting this, and the issue is going to become a political issue more and more, hopefully, in the next federal election. So New Hampshire is fighting several states, and they're saying that it's an unprecedented attack on local control. So states and cities are really fighting this in the U.S., and the federal government is using the Telecommunications Act of 1996 to say that no one can prevent towers going up based on environmental safety. There's debate with whether health is included in this because health is not mentioned in the 96 Telecom Act. So next slide is Susan Clark, a Harvard graduate, saying just that issue, that environmental effects does not include health effects. So the debate is ongoing. So I'll skip the next slide. Massachusetts has 5 bills.
Which number are you on, please, André?
Number 26. 25, actually. Massachusetts is leading the nation with 5 bills to protect its citizens, thanks to CSTUSET. They're looking notably at smart meters and informing scientists, the public, more about their exposure. The Maine Wireless Act, the next slide, was not adopted, but would have been the strictest in the nation, requiring manufacturers' information on radio frequency exposure to be visible on the outside of cell phone product packaging. San Francisco did it, and the law was struck down. So Berkeley came up with another municipal law, and it's still standing. It's being fought by the industry, but thanks to Dr. Moskowitz, they do have to label the packaging in Berkeley. So the next slide is how the Supreme Court has looked at that and sent it back to the appeals court. The CTIA is fighting the Berkeley regulation. Next one, I'm mentioning the pesticides. The 2001 Supreme Court of Canada ruling, Hudson, next to Montreal, western part of Montreal, 2,4-D was banned there, and thanks to that Supreme Court ruling, Quebec was the first province to ban 2,4-D, or cosmetic use of pesticides, based on the precautionary principle. Now, is it going to happen? If we go 2 slides further, slide number 30, Rogers versus Chateauguay. Chateauguay, another city on the south shore of Montreal, tried to block a cell tower based on the precautionary principle, and they mentioned health, and the Supreme Court said no, a city cannot act on that. And to me, it's I don't understand that ruling, because it should be based on the 2001 pesticides ruling that cities can protect the citizens' health. If we back up one, you see Arthur Furstenberg suing the city of Santa Fe for it to protect its citizens. 32, I spoke to lawyer Michel Bélanger, who is a pioneer in class action environmental lawsuits in Quebec, and he says that unfortunately that Chateauguay ruling really brings us back. He says that when you win in the environmental courts, you take a step forward. When you lose, you go back 3. So you really have to pick your battles. That's why for many years people have asked him to launch a class action lawsuit, and he hasn't done it yet because he didn't feel that he had a strong case. And the next slide is Charles O'Brien, who with Andrew Mikrovsky and many others launched a case which was rejected. The class action was called frivolous by the judge. it was quite ambitious because they were suing everyone, and they're from government to industry and cities and everyone. So has it set us back? Hopefully not this case. Hopefully others will follow and will be accepted by the courts. Before we finish, we have the Court of Rome. This was really interesting. In the 90s, I believe, Radio Vatican, owned by the Vatican, the most powerful FM antenna in the world, they were convicted. They didn't put the cardinal in jail, but they had to lower the power of the antenna. And what we're seeing in the courts, if I can finish with this, in Italy, there were several judgments linked to acoustic numeromas. A fifth court on May 29, I'm reading from a very recent article, 4 cases, 5 courts, because it went to the U.S. Supreme Court. The first ruling, the Marcolini case, which was from 2009, he spoke on a cell phone for 5-6 hours a day. The next rulings of 2017 went down, were focused on people speaking 3 to 4 hours and then 2 to 3 hours a day for 10 to 15 years. And the courts compensated those people. And the expert and technical advisors assigned to evaluate the case said that they based their recommendation on the duration of exposure, the type of devices used, i.e. deck phones and cell phones, the type of pathology, and the review of the literature, because of course the acoustic neuroma is linked directly to cell phone use on the same side of the head for many years. So to them, the duration of exposure, the type of exposure, the type of pathology, and the review of the literature were sufficient for a causal link for these tribunals, even in the absence of clear, conclusive scientific evidence. So I hope that other tribunals around the world will look at these judgments, 5 decisions already from national courts in Italy. And I think that's about the time I've had.
Yeah, merci, André. What we're going to do